Now I'm really happy to introduce Mr. Felton, Mr. Nicholas Felton. I think it's only fair and polite to introduce him in English. I saw his work a few years ago at a presentation in Germany. That was the first time. And one of the things he showed was the Felton report. The Felton report is basically an annual report of his own personal activities, covering everything from the amount of tomatoes and beef he has eaten, to the friends he met up with, to the hours he slept while flying. The interesting thing is that these reports are designed in a way a company would do its annual report. On the backdrop of the recent disclosures and discussions about data security, this correlation between personal life, big data, and business statistics gives the Felton report a slightly ironic edge, at least. However you see it, from a graphic design and information visualization point of view, Felton's work is among the best. He has won several prizes. His work has been shown in magazines such as Wire, the Wall Street Journal, and Good, and he's one of the lead designers of Facebook. We're very happy and very, very proud to be able to present him here. Please give a hearty welcome to Nicholas Felton.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, first time in Switzerland. I'm looking forward to sharing my work with you. All right, so the project I'm here to share with you is a project that I made in 2010 about the life of my father, and this fit into the structure of annual reports that I've been working on for the past 8 years. Here you can see an example of one of those reports. This was the first print one I made in 2006, and this is an ongoing exploration of what it means to quantify our own life and how to turn those numbers into an expressive product. I think that it's a really good fit for this conference because the purposes of this project are really rooted in storytelling. As a graphic designer, you're always looking for material with which to work. And for me, having played with other people's narratives and having tried to make my own fictions, finding data that I could extract from my own life was really a revelation. And it's been a very exciting process of playing with it over the years, exploring new themes, and really meshing with this convergence of data and our daily lives. So the work that I do and the stories that I explore from data tend to perhaps be things that everyone in this room will be able to do in a few years from now without much effort. But for the time being, it requires a lot of effort on my part to get this result. So in this 8 years of working, I've identified several processes that I think are really interesting to talk about. And these are not, they're not in the literal design of the products. They're in the data gathering and the methodologies for retrieving this information that I think are appropriate to many domains and really interesting personally, because they solve this problem of, what if I could know this about myself? How would I get at that? This first approach is an archaeological approach, and this is one that I've put into practice when I've simply found myself with a set of data and I want to structure it so that I can apply data methodologies to it. So this is the one that I used in the first year, where in 2005 I didn't necessarily set out to make an annual report. I merely reached the end of the year and decided that I wanted to talk about what was noteworthy about it. And as I looked into the information I had at hand, one of the main things that I had access to was a song-by-song record of everything I'd listened to. Using the service Last.fm, it was connected to my computer, and so it kept a record. And I decided that this was really fruitful and interesting and told a great picture of myself, rather than the qualitative view of what I enjoyed that year. This was actual representation by the numbers of what I had enjoyed. And I decided to take this lens to other aspects of the year. So here you can see how I revisited my photographs and structured them by content and where the photos were taken to get a different view, a non-photographic view on the photos I had taken. So this archaeological approach is sometimes the only approach, and it's limited by whatever you have at hand. So it's never going to be better than the data that you have at hand, but as long as you embrace that, I think it can be fruitful. It's also very specialized, so you're probably not going to be able to turn this into a website or a digital app, because it just requires a lot of effort to structure everything on a moment-by-moment basis, unless you have a very similar set of data at hand. The next approach that I've come to rely on is what I call hoarding. This is simply gathering as much as possible, getting data from all walks of life, and trying to have as complete a view on the year as possible. In 2006, this was the approach that I relied on. So having put out the 2005 report, I was surprised to see that people who were not my friends, people who didn't know me, were actually interested in this view of my life. So I set out in 2006 to actually record all the restaurants, bars that I went to. I kept track of the food that I ate so that I could make this structured view of my eating habits. So you can see the diversity within this taxonomy of what I chose to eat in 2006. In 2007, I took this approach even further. There were certain things I neglected to record or didn't know that I wanted to know about myself in that year. And so you can see a map of the city here of New York and all the streets that I walked down. And I thought an interesting thing to know about myself is how many milligrams of caffeine I consumed. In particular, how many lethal doses would this have been if I'd simply had it all at once? And it's approximately seven lethal doses. 2008, again, uses this hoarding methodology, but now with a little bit of a different perspective. I thought it would be interesting to know how many miles I traveled over the course of the year. In actuality, I think that everyone in this room travels a different number of miles in a year, and we all have this unique number that represents how many miles we spent traveling to work, our sick days in which we didn't travel very many miles, or our vacations in which we may have traveled thousands of miles. And so for me, this number was over 38,000 miles, and even included statistics that I pulled from the video game Grand Theft Auto. This video game gave me very good statistics on the motorcycles that I drove and the helicopters that I flew, so I felt it only right that I include it in this accounting. Skipping ahead a little bit to 2010, 2011, I set out in 2010 to track my year with a little bit of a different lens. I was interested in how my personality might change based on the social context I was in. So I was interested in the restaurants that I would go to with my girlfriend, or what music do I listen to when I'm with my business partner, and how do these different relationships change the expression of my personality. So you can see this is a 2-year report comparing 2010, which is represented in cyan, and 2011 represented in the pink color. And their overlappings represent similarities between the year, or places that were visited that were duplicate, versus the individual colors or represent individual aspects. So here you can see how that manifests itself in my relationship with my girlfriend. You can see this map of New York shows the difference between 2010 and 2011, and especially encodes the story of how I moved to California to work on Facebook. And so my routines in 2011 became much more constrained to the things that I knew. I didn't have as much time to explore the city, and so I stuck with what I knew. This is the problem with this approach, is this is my calendar, and this is what it winds up looking like after you try and track everything that you're doing. So here you can see how people are encoded, places are encoded, eating and drinking are encoded. So there's a pretty high cost to this approach. here you can see if we analyze this approach of hoarding, what it actually means. The costs are high, as I said. It's a very ongoing and taxing process. I found that it can be addictive, so once you're exposed to a data source, it's hard to give it up. So at the beginning of the year, I'm always changing methodologies, and if this means that I have to keep track of the people that I'm with in 1 year, at the end of the year, it can be hard to give up on this approach, and it's something that I don't know the value of, but I may need later. And it's also limited in its abilities to address certain problems. Here I call these the intractable set. So food can be hoarded towards, but it's a very difficult process, and in the end you wind up with a pretty unstructured data set. I think reading is a really interesting thing to know about oneself, but this is very fragmented in our lives. We don't sit down and read one book. We tend to read websites, we tend to read ebooks, we read magazines, and all these things can be very hard to keep track of. And it's something that I would like to know about myself. Mood is a thing that I've wrestled with before. I'd love to know what my mood is on an ongoing basis, but I find this hard to describe about myself, and especially to know on a continual basis. Similarly, TV, conversation, social context, I think all of these things are quite fascinating, but just really hard to capture on an ongoing basis. So the third process that I've adopted is what I consider sampling. Here we're giving up on collecting everything. We're just interested in having high precision on certain moments of the day. In 2009, I first tried this approach. So I developed these business cards, and if I was with a person and I felt that we had a meaningful encounter, then I would hand them this card. And on the back, there was a URL and an individual number. And I would keep track of who I gave the card to, what the number was, and where we were. This meant on a daily basis, I was giving it to my office mates almost every day. But in more random parts of my life, I would give it to my dentist, or I would give it to the drunk man sitting at the bar who decided to talk to me for too long. And what I would ask the person is for them to report back to me on a host of different descriptors of our encounter. So where we were, what my mood was in particular, what we ate or drank, things we discussed, if we used transportation, how long we'd known each other. And through this process, I was actually able to get at this question that had really been bugging me, which is, what is my mood? And I received, I think, about 1,700 reports. In each one, they're using at least one term to describe my mood, and it's this really unstructured set of information. And so I used a process by which I implemented Amazon's Mechanical Turk. And this is a service where you can just ask random people on the internet to do tasks for, say, 5 cents. And I asked them to categorize all these different mood terms. And at the end of this, I was able to discern that my mood for the year was swell. It was, I think, 73.9% happy. In 2012, I revisited this sampling methodology. And one of the things I'd wanted to do for a long time is just simply have maybe a watch or an alarm that would go off at random intervals and ask me to record things. And what I realized was the phone that I carry around every day is capable of this and much, much more. So I commissioned an iPhone app that would buzz at random intervals. I found that approximately 90 minutes was enough to be not too frequent and yet capture enough of the different activities that were happening over the course of the day. So as it would go off, it would record all this background information, like what was my location, what was the time, what was the weather like, how many photos have been added to my phone since the last time it went off. And through this process, the other half of that is, that's all the background information, and then I would fill out a survey that would say where I was, what I was doing, what I was wearing, what tools I was using, what I was eating or drinking. And this is the results you can see here. it's sort of structured in a similar way to the survey, so it's looking at where I was, who I was with, activities that I took up, and here you can see this graph of activities. So with the thousands of reports that made up this year, I can start to build up this almost probabilistic view of what I might be doing over the course of the day. So you can see at the beginning of the day, I'm most likely asleep, and then these spikes in different aspects of my life. So driving is a thing I'm very likely to do first thing in the morning, versus reading or watching or activities that are tend to expand during later hours. So the sampling approach I found very, very helpful, and here you can see some of the reasons I tend to gravitate to it. There's a lot of value in simply having incompleteness. This incompleteness actually makes up for your inability to capture this information in other parts of your life, and it really gives you insight into these behaviors that can be inaccessible otherwise. So I skipped over the 2010 report. This one's a little bit different, and this is one that is near and dear to my heart. This is using that archaeological method again. And it's a report that talks about the life of my father. So he passed away in 2010 at the age of 81, and you know, he had me when he was almost 50, so he had this entire life prior to me that I was not around for. And there are aspects of his life that are our family's lore. So these are things that I know about him, where and when he was born, this saga of how he was sent out of Berlin when he was 10 to live with a foster family, how his father was killed by the Nazis, he was an elevator mechanic and traveled extensively. But I wanted to fill out more of his story and actually answer some of the mysteries around his life. So his brother used to always claim that he was a part of the CIA because he would go to these countries and there would be a revolution or an explosion, or he just couldn't explain his traveling. So this was one of the reasons I was interested in delving into his life, into the portions that I didn't know as well, and learning what was actually happening. So when he passed away, my sister and I took care of his estate. We sorted his belongings, and the more that we looked through them, the more fascinating and deep data sets I found available. This is just a little sampling of it, but it includes calendars, passports, slides, and a few other knickknacks here and there. But I realized that there was enough here to really tell his rich story of his life, to actually use this to recompile places he'd been, friends that he spent time with, all these different dimensions. And I had this hunch that, you know, he had traveled so extensively, perhaps I could build something like this. Perhaps I could figure out all the places that he'd been and really reconstruct his movements. So this is the cover of the 2010 report, and I'll take you through a little bit of the process of how I extracted information from different aspects of the mementos we had at hand. Here you can see a year-by-year look at the amount of information that was actually available. So in 1929, there's just a little blip that represents his birth certificate, and up into the 70s, it starts to get quite rich. And then I think what happened is he married my mother, and she took over the data-keeping duties for the family, so it gets quite dry until 1985 when they were divorced, and then he becomes the record keeper for himself again. So this is also showing the relationship between calendars and photos and other documents at hand. I think this graph behind me is interesting as well. This is a close-up of that page, and you can kind of see how the amount of documents available for each decade, it really starts to mirror our memories, that we have more and more memories the more, for more recent time periods. So this period of 2000 to 2010 has 1,800 records versus the decade he was born and a little bit about his parents. We only have 14 documents. So it's this, I think it's reminiscent of memory, but it's also reminiscent of just the process that we go through as we move houses and we sort of cull the personal materials that we bring with us. So, in terms of the documents at hand, these are some of the older ones. This includes his original birth certificate, his first apprentice agreement in England, marriage certificate, and his certificate of naturalization when he came to the States. These are some of the ways in which he was very helpful. So I guess at certain points in his life, he merely sat down and decided to keep track year by year of the places he'd lived or the people he'd worked for. And these were a couple of those notes. On the left are all elevator companies that he worked for, and on the right are places that he lived. Family trees are a thing that I looked at and incorporated. But receipts were actually a thing that surprised me. I didn't think these would be valuable and they look like trash, but actually they're really fascinating because these are both telling the story of a place and a time where he was, and the older they are, the richer that information is to me. So here we have one from 2002, and another one from 2002 from a European trip that he was on. And when you start to quantify all these different documents, I can start to make a page that looks like this. So this is typical of the 2010 report. It tends to use the decade on the left. I tried to humanize it by including a photo of him. And then on the right, it delves into a given data set. In this case, I had all his grades from when he was in sort of high school in England, and I can track the process of his schooling and how on top you can see he was a good English student until the last semester, and then he fell off, and the rates of all his grades. Calendars were a really, really rich data set that he'd left behind. So I think there were about 30 years of calendars. Some of them were very explicit, like when he's traveling, he tended to keep really good notes, versus ones where he was at home, which tended to be much more sparse. But in looking through this and really categorizing the entries in large terms, I can get to a story like this one. So this merely looks for mentions of work, mentions of travel, and mentions of his children. And you can see this story of the decade in which he retired. So work, this white graph, really plummets, and time with children and traveling rises. Postcards were another thing that were really interesting to me. In this case, these are simply ones that he collected, so I just assumed that if he had a blank postcard that represented some place that he'd been, and on the back they would tell me the name of that location. But postcards that were sent to him were even more valuable because now these include his address and typically the date he lived there. So given all these postcards, and I probably had a couple hundred of the ones he received over 40 odd years, I was able to make this map that shows all the different apartments I could identify that he lived in the Bay Area in California. And you can see how he moves around from the 60s in San Francisco to the East Bay, and then later on into the North Bay, which is where I grew up. Passports is another really fascinating set. There are about 50 years of passports that I had access to. An interesting exercise in trying to not only decrypt some of the mess that these customs agents leave behind, but also in trying to simply translate other languages like Greek, and really being grateful for the internet tools that we have now that allow you to find a strange website where you can type in Greek characters and figure out where these places were. But photographs I found to be basically the richest data set. There were photos like this that were personally familiar. This is the house I was born in, my mother and father, so I know what that's about. Ones that are generally familiar, I think everyone in this room knows where this is. And then ones that just have lost context. So it's going to be really hard to figure out where this is. But there's a middle zone that's rich and fascinating. And these are ones in which the context is discoverable, but somewhat hidden. And so what I was trying to do from the photos is, again, add to that map, add locations, try and figure out when he was there if possible. And because these were all slides that were scanned at high resolution, if there's any piece of text like this little one in the corner, I could zoom in and figure out that, you know, if you squint your eyes, that says Salinas, and it's the Salinas Rodeo in California, so that gives me another point on the map. In this case, there's a little bit of text on the van on the left, and by zooming in, you can see that says Dijon. And using our amazing tools that we have at hand, if you do a Google image search for Dijon, France, you start to see all these different images, and it looks like that's the main square. In fact, this image here, which is taken quite recently of the main square in Dijon, matches up pretty well with the photo that he took 40 or 50 years ago. In fact, almost all text is categorizable now. So business names I found from photos he'd taken in Brazil were really great entry points for finding out what city these were in. In this case, simply Googling the first few lines of this gravestone leads to a Wikipedia entry that tells you everything you would want to know about this person and where the photo was taken. This was another one that was in a batch of photos that were taken at the Iguazu waterfall. But you know, I don't want to leap to conclusions and say automatically this is there. So again, with our modern tools, you can call that up on Google Earth and zoom in and find the building again and feel like you're part of the CIA. And then there were things that were just beyond my ability, and what I was able to do for about 50 images that I thought were identifiable, but I just didn't have the entry points to figure out where they were taken. I put them out on Twitter and asked people if they had any hunches as to where this was. And in a case like this, it's really amazing all the things that people start to pick up on. So in this case, people identified the shape of the mountain, they identified the Taiwanese flag, they identified the building itself, and were able to narrow this down through this little Flickr conversation that this was taken at a monastery in Taiwan that served as a guest house in the 60s, and a little bit more Googling and I was able to find images that really corroborated that. So here you can see this atlas. This is the image that I was really interested in creating, and I think my hunch was correct in that you can start to see the silhouettes of the continents emerging from his travels. This graphic is simply just triangulating the points. It's not trying to draw a line in between the progression in which he visited places, because I don't always know that, but for Europe and for the east and west coast of the Americas, it gives a really good distinction. And then there are other countries like Africa, South America that are more roughly defined. In the end, I built this index, so this is kind of a counterpoint to the table of contents in which I talked about all the data sources. Here I'm simply trying to make a best of list of all the museums, all the restaurants that he visited over the course of his life. And what was really interesting to me is when we finally had a memorial service for him and invited all his 70 and 80-year-old friends, this was one of the pages that they really picked up on. They were not intimidated by the tiny typography and delved in and were able to say, I remember that, I remember going to this place with your father, or this is the place where we were married, this was a great memory that we have of him. So as a way of really solidifying his shared memory with his friends, it was a great success. And one of the final artifacts that was really near and dear to me was this scroll that I discovered in one of his drawers. And I didn't really know what it was until I opened it up. And I realized that this was actually kind of brings the project completely full circle. So this was a EKG of his heartbeat from 1974. And in this process of taking his data and condensing it and turning it into graphs, it's really amazing that one of the pieces of his memory that I have access to and really talks most concretely about his life force is actually a graph. And so this is how it was included in the report, sort of his graphic contribution to the project alongside this story of the 70s for him. And that's the story of my father.